So our next task is to work on the select activity, which is obviously broken based on our previous activities, so let's go and take a look at how we can resolve this. And first of all, let's take a look at what we're currently doing, or what we were doing, to display that particular activity. Now inside our activity dashboard, or let's go up to the highest level, the app.tsx, what we're doing in here is we've got a handle select activity method that takes an ID, and then it sets a selected activity and uses the activities filter method to go and retrieve the individual activity we want and then pass it into this selected activity piece of state that we're using locally. And we're also using an edit mode here as well to track whether or not the form should be open. And what we're doing is we're passing this down to our activity dashboard with the select activity and selected activity. And if we take a look at our activity dashboard, then we're using this information to display our activity details component. So let's go back to our activity store and start setting this up. And what we're going to need to do is we're going to need an observable for the selected activity. So let's create this. And this is going to be a type of iActivity. And what we want to do is set this to null initially. And of course, TypeScript is complaining because we can't assign null to a type of iActivity. So we're going to need to give this a union type. And we'll specify that it can be an iActivity or it can be null. And what we also need is another observable for the edit mode. And let's set this initially to false. And we don't need to worry about setting a type when it's a simple property such as this, because TypeScript will infer that this is going to be a Boolean based on its initial value. And what we'll do is we'll create a new action for selecting the activity. So let's just scroll below our load activities action, and we'll add another action, and this one we'll call select activity. And this is going to take an ID as a parameter, which of course is a string. And what we'll do inside here is we'll say list.selected activity is equal to, and we'll pluck out the activity we want from our activities array. So we'll say list.activities, and we have access to all of our typical array methods, and what we can use in this case is we can use the find method. And the find method returns the value of the first element in the array where the predicate is true and undefined otherwise. So we'll use this, and we'll say in the expression that a goes to a.id, which is equal to the ID. And we're getting an error here because the selected activity is recognizing that the type of iActivity or undefined is not assignable to type iActivity or null. And this is based on the fact that the find method returns undefined if it doesn't find the activity that matches this particular ID. So what we'll do actually, we'll just come up to our selected activity, and instead of specifying iActivity or null, we'll just specify it as undefined, and we'll set its initial value to undefined as well. Or in fact, we don't even need to. We can simply remove the initial value here and this will still work fine, because our selected activity is going to be iActivity or undefined. And when we don't define its value, of course, it's going to be undefined. And what we also want to do in here is set the edit mode equal to false, so we're matching what we did inside our local state. So what we need to do then is get our new method and our selected activity and utilize this instead of what we were doing inside our app.tsx. Now instead of passing this down to our activity dashboard from our app component, we don't need to do that if we're using centralized state, because we can go and get our state directly from the store inside our activity dashboard, and that's what we'll do. So let's go to the activity dashboard. And what we want to do is bring our activity store inside here so we have access to it. So I'm going to say const activity store equals use context, and then we'll pass in the activity store. Now VS Code at this current time does not deal well with how we've exported our activity store, so it struggles to import this automatically. And if I take a look at what we're doing here, we're basically creating we're using our default export and creating the context with the new activity store, and VS Code just doesn't seem able to cope with bringing this in automatically. So I'm just going to add this manually and go up to the imports, and we'll say import activity store from, and we need to go up to our app and stores and activity store. And then we have access to our activity store here. And what we'll do is we'll just destructure the properties we need from our activity store. So what we need is, we need the edit mode and we need the selected activity. And we'll set this equal to our activity store variable. Now we're getting some warnings here because we've duplicated the identifiers, so we'll need to remove the edit mode and selected activity from our destructured props in our activity dashboard. And this also means that we can move our edit mode and selected activity from our interface here as well. And we also see an error here because we're passing these properties down from a higher level, but we've now removed them from our interface. So if we click on the error here, we'll see that property selected activity does not exist on type, intrinsic attributes, and iProps, etc. So if we click on this, we'll see that we've got our activity dashboard highlighted here, and we can simply remove the edit mode and the selected activity from here as well, and that will remove the warning. So back in our activity dashboard then, we've now got our selected activity coming from our store, and our edit mode as well also coming from our store, and we're only displaying our activity details component if we have something inside here. But what we'll also do is we'll hook up our activity details component directly to our activity store as well. So instead of passing down all of these props to our activity details, what we can do is we can hook up our activity details component directly to the store as well. And we'll do this. Let's open up our activity details. And inside here, what we'll do is we'll bring in our activity store. So we'll say const activity store equals use context. And we'll pass in our activity store. And I'll just import this as well. So we'll say import activity store from, and we'll go up to our app and stores and activity store. And what we'll also do is we'll just destructure what we need from here. So we need the selected activity, and we'll set this equal to the activity store. But what we also want to do is, to save a bit of typing, we want to call this activity rather than selected activity, so we don't need to adjust all of these properties inside here. So what we'll do is we'll add a colon and then we'll just refer to this as activity. Now of course we get the warning about duplicate identifiers, so we'll also need to remove activity from our destructured props, and then we can do the same from the interface as well. And we're getting a bunch of errors because our activity here could possibly be undefined. Now this is one of those occasions where we know better than TypeScript, because we're only going to be displaying this component if we have something inside our activity. But TypeScript doesn't know this. Because we've specified in our store that our activity here could either be an iActivity or it can be undefined, then it doesn't know, or it's unable to infer, that we'll have loaded this activity and have something inside here that it can't possibly know of at this point. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to add the not null assertion operator, otherwise known as bang or an exclamation mark, to these properties to say basically to TypeScript that as a developer, I know this can't be null right now or undefined right now, and it's going to be something. And we'll just, for now, we'll just add exclamation marks or bangs to each of these properties to remove this warning, and that should be fine. Now we've still got an error here because up the chain we've removed one of our properties from our interface. So let's just go take a look at this particular error. And what we need to do is remove the activity that we're passing down there inside our activity dashboard for the activity details components. Let's just remove that. And back in our activity details, what we also need to do, because we're observing this activity and it's going to change from its initial state, we need to make our activity details component an observer here as well. So let's just add that to this particular component, and we'll also import this from MobX React Lite. And we're now going to be observing the activity from our store. So our component will be notified of any changes to this particular activity. Now what we also need to do is go to our activity list, because this contains the button that we use to set the selected activities. So let's take a look at our activity list. And in our onClick event, we've got the select activity, but this is coming down from a piece of local state. And if we look inside this component, we're passing in select activity via its parent component. And if we go up to its parent component, and the parent of the activity list is the activity dashboard, and scroll up, we can see that we're passing this particular property down to our activity list. And we're getting this from our app components. We're passing this function down quite a few times to get it to the activity list. So what we'll do inside our activity list is also connect this directly to our activity store, so we get access to the select activity function we've created in there. So I'll just add another import for our activity store. So I'll say const activity store equals use context, and say activity store, and once again I'm going to need to import this manually. So we'll say import activity store from, and we'll go up to the app and stores and activity store. And since we're connecting to our store directly, what we can also do is just bring our activities directly into this component as well, rather than passing them down via our activity dashboard. So what we'll do, we'll destructure our activities and the select activity function from our activity store. And because we've got conflicting identifiers, we'll also need to remove these two props from in here. So I'll remove these and also remove the corresponding properties from our interface. We don't need the activities or the select activity in here either. So we can remove them, and we can also do it at the higher level because we're getting an error now. So let's just click on the error and we'll go to this, and we don't need our select activity or our activities here. So let's remove both of those, and we'll go back to our activities list. Now our activities stays the same because we're getting these from our activity store and then we're just looping over them. And we've got this component as an observer, so we're going to see the changes once our activities have loaded, so that should work fine. And we've got our select activity, and this is called the same name as what we had before, and it still takes the activity ID as its parameter. So if we've got everything set up correctly, what we should be able to do now is go back and find ourselves in the same position that we were before. And if I just go to my browser and I click on to view an activity, we can see that it's loading on the right hand side. And we should be able to click on our different activities, and that's working fine. Excellent. So we're going to continue refactoring until we've got all of our local state outside of MobX. But before we do, I just want to touch on async await as an alternative to using promised len chaining, which is what we've been using so far for our asynchronous methods, and we'll take a look at that next.